Hello, my name's Josh. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I've recently been through a divorce. Thanks for coming back to my channel. Today I'd like to discuss some podcasts that really helped me get through my divorce. One thing that's really important, I think, when going through a divorce, and it was for me at least, was finding things to fill my mind with. So I did a lot of reading of books, listening to general conference, listening to scriptures, but sometimes I just needed something else to listen to as well. And so I'm going to give you 5 podcasts that I found to just be really helpful in my divorce process for a variety of reasons. The first one that I really liked was called Classic Speeches from BYU. So it was just it's a collection of old BYU devotional speeches. Some of them were really, really good. Some I'd never heard before. Some of them were from old general authorities or staff members or whatever the case may be. But I always found those talks to be really good. There was a couple that, I remember listening to them at the time and they didn't really do much for me, but they were still a good talk. And so, Classic BYU Speeches is definitely a really good kind of uplifting podcast to listen to. The next one that I really enjoyed a lot was the All In podcast by LDS Living. I really enjoyed listening to the stories of all the people that would come on that podcast. Whether it was people who were divorced, so I could relate to kind of what they were talking about, or maybe someone who'd been through having someone close to them take their life, or someone who'd been through some other real difficult tragedies and trials in their life and the triumphs that came along with it. I really found that podcast to be really helpful, because although most of the people weren't going through what I was going through, I just found the stories of their struggles and their triumphs to be somewhat inspirational to me, and especially how that relates to the gospel and how it relates to their relationship with the Savior. The next podcast that I really enjoyed was the Jennifer Finlayson Fife podcast. Now, for anyone who doesn't know who she is, she's a PhD. I think she's a psychiatrist. She specializes in human sexuality, and she does marriage counseling and therapy and things of that nature. But she talks on a variety of topics within relation to marriage, intimacy, and a wide variety of topics that kind of surround that. I really enjoyed her podcast. The way that she was able to articulate things to me was very helpful, particularly when she would talk about things like intimacy. And I don't just mean sexual intimacy. I'm just saying the topic in general of intimacy and vulnerability and how that works together and how that creates a strong marriage. It may sound silly or funny to you, but as I was going through my divorce and I would hear her articulate these ideas around marriage and what that should be like, I would just listen to it and think, that's what I want. That is what I want. And so here I am in the middle of this divorce, but I can see a light. And maybe it's not with the spouse that I'm no longer with, but it's with a future spouse. Whatever the case may be, I could see hope for something better in the future. And for me, that was really helpful. For others, I could see how it could not be. But for me, it was very helpful. So I kind of classify those ones as the 3 podcasts that kind of help lift me up, help me feel inspired, and help me just kind of pull myself out of my divorce situation and distract myself, but in kind of a spiritual way. The next 2 podcasts were for me just fun. First of all, I'm somewhat intellectually curious, so I like podcasts that cover a whole bunch of different topics. So the first one that I really loved was one by Malcolm Gladwell, and it's called Revisionist History. I've read a couple of his books. I've enjoyed his books very much. But his podcast, every episode was a different topic, and they'd look at the way something is done, or an event in history, or there's a multitude of things that they would look at, and they would investigate it and look at it from different perspectives, and they would interview people. And I always found it to be kind of enlightening whenever I would listen to it, or I'd gain a new perspective on something. But they were always very interesting, even topics that I thought I would never even care about, like museums and artwork and how they register artwork and things of that nature, something I would never care about. I found those episodes just to be so interesting. And it's part of it is in his presentation, but again, it was a great distraction for me through the divorce process. The final podcast that I personally really enjoyed, for this kind of the same reason as the Revisionist History podcast, was the Joe Rogan podcast, which is obviously the world's most famous podcast right now. I just enjoyed that he always had different people on his show. Everything from UFC fighters to politicians to musicians to economists and archaeologists and physicists and everything in between. I really enjoyed the conversational format, and I always felt like I walked away from those having learned something. Sometimes it may have been useless information, but I felt like I learned something, and the conversational format that was in that podcast was the conversational format plus just interesting types of topics were just, for me, really good to listen to. And again, it was just a great distraction from the divorce. Because sometimes, at least for me, when I was going through the divorce, it seems like it's all you can think about. Even when you're at work, when you're at home, when you're with your kids, no matter what's going on, it seems to be always laying on your mind. And so these podcasts for me were definitely something that were a great distraction from that. And, as I said before, my divorce process was 18 months. And actually I started listening to these before that while we were going through some pretty difficult times. And they were just a really great thing that uplifted me, that distracted me, and helped me get through the divorce process. So I need to make it really clear. None of these podcasts are sponsoring this video. None of them know who I am. So these really are just 5 podcasts that I really just enjoyed and listened to during my divorce process. And frankly, I still listen to them now because I've grown to enjoy them. So again, my name's Josh. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. My channel is not endorsed by the church. All of my thoughts are my own. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a therapist. But I've learned a few lessons along the way, and hopefully they can help you too. Thanks for coming back to my channel.